The second book, entitled Euterpe. On the death of Cyrus, Cambyses, his son, by Cassandani, daughter of Pharnaspes, took the kingdom. Cassandani had died in the lifetime of Cyrus, who had made a great mourning for her at her death, and had commanded all the subjects of his empire to observe the like. Cambyses, the son of this lady and of Cyrus, regarding the Ionian and Aeolian Greeks as vassals of his father, took them with him in his expedition against Egypt, among the other nations which owned his sway. Now the Egyptians, before the reign of their king Psammetichus, believed themselves to be the most ancient of mankind. Since Psammetichus, however, made an attempt to discover who were actually the primitive race, they've been of opinion that while they surpass all other nations, the Phrygians surpass them in antiquity. This king, finding it impossible to make out by dint of inquiry what men were the most ancient, contrived the following method of discovery. He took 2 children of the common sort, and gave them over to a herdsman to bring up at his folds, strictly charging him to let no one utter a word in their presence, but to keep them in a sequestered cottage, and from time to time introduce goats to their apartment, see that they got their fill of milk, and in all other respects look after them. His object herein was to know, after the indistinct babblings of infancy were over, what word they would first articulate. It happened as he had anticipated. The herdsman obeyed his orders for 2 years, and at the end of that time, on his one day opening the door of their room and going in, the children both ran up to him with outstretched arms and distinctly said, "Bekos." When this first happened, the herdsman took no notice, but afterwards, when he observed on coming often to see after them that the word was constantly in their mouths, he informed his lord, and by his command brought the children into his presence. Psammetichus then himself heard them say the word, upon which he proceeded to make inquiry what people there was who called anything Bekos, and hereupon he learnt that Bekos was the Phrygian name for bread. In consideration of this circumstance, the Egyptians yielded their claims and admitted the greater antiquity of the Phrygians. That these were the real facts I learned at Memphis from the priests of Hephaestus. The Greeks, among other foolish tales, relate that Psammetichus had the children brought up by women whose tongues he had previously cut out, but the priests said their bringing up was such as I have stated above. I got much other information also from conversation with these priests while I was at Memphis, and I even went to Heliopolis and to Thebes expressly to try whether the priests of those places would agree in their accounts with the priests at Memphis. The Heliopolitans have the reputation of being the best skilled in history of all the Egyptians. What they told me concerning their religion, it's not my intention to repeat, except the names of their deities, which I believe all men know equally. If I relate anything else concerning these matters, it'll only be when compelled to do so by the course of my narrative. Now, with regard to mere human matters, the accounts which they gave, and in which all agreed, were the following. The Egyptians, they said, were the first to discover the solar year, and to portion out its course into 12 parts. They obtained this knowledge from the stars. To my mind, they contrived their year much more cleverly than the Greeks, for these last, every other year, intercalate a whole month, but the Egyptians, dividing the year into 12 months of 30 days each, add every year a space of 5 days besides, whereby the circuit of the seasons is made to return with uniformity. The Egyptians, they went on to affirm, first brought into use the names of the 12 gods, which the Greeks adopted from them, and first erected altars, images, and temples to the gods, and also first engraved upon stone the figures of animals. In most of these cases they proved to me that what they said was true, and they told me that the first man who ruled over Egypt was Maine, and that in his time all Egypt, except the Thebaic canton, was a marsh, none of the land below Lake Moeris then showing itself above the surface of the water. This is a distance of 7 days' sail from the sea up the river. What they said of their country seemed to me very reasonable, for anyone who sees Egypt without having heard a word about it before must perceive, if he has only common powers of observation, that the Egypt to which the Greeks go in their ships is an acquired country, the gift of the river. The same is true of the land above the lake, to the distance of 3 days' voyage, concerning which the Egyptians say nothing, but which is exactly the same kind of country. The following is the general character of the region. In the first place, on approaching it by sea, when you're still a day's sail from the land, if you let down a sounding line, you'll bring up mud, and find yourself in 11 fathoms of water, which shows that the soil washed down by the stream extends to that distance. The length of the country along shore, according to the bounds which we assign to Egypt, namely from the Plinthenetic Gulf to Lake Sebonis, which extends along the base of Mount Cassius, is 60 skeins. The nations whose territories are scanty measure them by the fathom, those whose bounds are less confined by the furlong, those who have an ample territory by the parasang, but if men have a country which is very vast, they measure it by the skein. Now the length of the parasang is 30 furlongs, but the skein, which is an Egyptian measure, is 60 furlongs. Thus the coastline of Egypt would extend a length of 3,600 furlongs. From the coast inland, as far as Heliopolis, the breadth of Egypt is considerable. The country is flat, without springs, and full of swamps. The length of the route from the sea up to Heliopolis is almost exactly the same as that of the road which runs from the altar of the 12 gods at Athens to the temple of Olympian Jove at Pisa. If a person made a calculation, he'd find but a very little difference between the two routes, not more than about 15 furlongs, for the road from Athens to Pisa falls short of 1,500 furlongs by exactly 15, whereas the distance of Heliopolis from the sea is just the round number. As one proceeds beyond Heliopolis up the country, Egypt becomes narrow. The Arabian range of hills, which has a direction from north to south, shutting it in upon the one side, and the Libyan range upon the other. The former ridge runs on without a break, and stretches away to the sea called the Erythraean. It contains the quarries from whence the stone was cut for the pyramids of Memphis, and this is the point where it ceases its first direction and bends away in the manner above indicated. In its greatest length from east to west, it is, as I've been informed, a distance of 2 months' journey. Towards the extreme east, its skirts produce frankincense. Such are the chief features of this range. On the Libyan side, the other ridge whereon the pyramids stand is rocky and covered with sand. Its direction is the same as that of the Arabian ridge in the first part of its course. Above Heliopolis, then, there's no great breadth of territory for such a country as Egypt, but during 4 days' sail, Egypt is narrow. The valley between the two ranges is a level plain, and seemed to me to be, at the narrowest point, not more than 200 furlongs across from the Arabian to the Libyan hills. Above this point, Egypt again widens. From Heliopolis to Thebes is 9 days' sail up the river. The distance is 81 skeins, or 4,860 furlongs. If we now put together the several measurements of the country, we shall find that the distance along shore is, as I stated above, 3,600 furlongs, and the distance from the sea inland to Thebes, 6,120 furlongs. Further, it's a distance of 1,800 furlongs from Thebes to the place called Elephantine. The greatest portion of the country above described seemed to me to be, as the priests declared, a tract gained by the inhabitants, For the whole region above Memphis, lying between the two ranges of hills that have been spoken of, appeared evidently to have formed at one time a gulf of the sea. It resembles, to compare small things with great, the parts about Ilium and Teuthrania, Ephesus, and the plain of the Maeander. In all these regions the land has been formed by rivers, whereof the greatest is not to compare for size with any one of the 5 mouths of the Nile. I could mention other rivers also far inferior to the Nile in magnitude that have effected very great changes. Among these, not the least, is the Achelous, which, after passing through Acarnania, empties itself into the sea opposite the islands called Echinades, and has already joined one half of them to the continent. In Arabia, not far from Egypt, there's a long and narrow gulf running inland from the sea called the Erythraean, of which I will here set down the dimensions. Starting from its innermost recess and using a rowboat, you take 40 days to reach the open main, while you may cross the gulf at its widest part in the space of half a day. In this sea there's an ebb and flow of the tide every day. My opinion is that Egypt was formerly very much such a gulf as this. One gulf penetrated from the sea that washes Egypt on the north and extended itself towards Ethiopia. Another entered from the southern ocean and stretched towards Syria. The two gulfs ran into the land so as almost to meet each other, and left between them only a very narrow tract of country. Now, if the Nile should choose to divert his waters from their present bed into this Arabian Gulf, what is there to hinder it from being filled up by the stream within at the utmost 20,000 years? For my part, I think it would be filled in half the time. How then should not a gulf even of much greater size have been filled up in the ages that passed before I was born, by a river that is at once so large and so given to working changes? Thus I give credit to those from whom I received this account of Egypt, and am myself, moreover, strongly of the same opinion, since I remarked that the country projects into the sea further than the neighbouring shores, and I observed that there were shells upon the hills, and that salt exuded from the soil to such an extent as even to injure the pyramids. And I noticed also that there is but a single hill in all Egypt where sand is found, namely the hill above Memphis. And further, I found the country to bear no resemblance either to its borderland, Arabia, or to Libya, nay, nor even to Syria, which forms the seaboard of Arabia. But whereas the soil of Libya is, we know, sandy and of a reddish hue, and that of Arabia and Syria inclines to stone and clay, Egypt has a soil that's black and crumbly, as being alluvial and formed of the deposits brought down by the river from Ethiopia. One fact which I learned of the priests is to me a strong evidence of the origin of the country. They said that when Moeris was king, the Nile overflowed all Egypt below Memphis, as soon as it rose so little as 8 cubits. Now Moeris had not been dead 900 years at the time when I heard this of the priests, yet at the present day, unless the river rise 16, or at the very least 15 cubits, it doesn't overflow the lands. It seems to me, therefore, that if the land goes on rising and growing at this rate, the Egyptians who dwell below Lake Moeris, in the delta, as it's called, and elsewhere, will one day, by the stoppage of the inundations, suffer permanently the fate which they told me they expected would some time or other befall the Greeks. On hearing that the whole land of Greece is watered by rain from heaven, and not like their own inundated by rivers, they observed, some day the Greeks will be disappointed of their grand hope, and then they will be wretchedly hungry. Which was as much as to say, if God shall some day see fit not to grant the Greeks rain, but shall afflict them with a long drought, the Greeks will be swept away by a famine, since they have nothing to rely on but rain from Jove, and have no other resource for water. And certes, in thus speaking of the Greeks, the Egyptians say nothing but what is true. But now let me tell the Egyptians how the case stands with themselves. If, as I said before, the country below Memphis, which is the land that is always rising, continues to increase in height at the rate at which it has risen in times gone by, how will it be possible for the inhabitants of that region to avoid hunger when they'll certainly have no rain, and the river will not be able to overflow their cornlands? At present, it must be confessed, they obtain the fruits of the field with less trouble than any other people in the world, the rest of the Egyptians included, since they have no need to break up the ground with the plough, nor to use the hoe, nor to do any of the work which the rest of mankind finds necessary if they are to get a crop. But the husbandman waits till the river has of its own accord spread itself over the fields and withdrawn again to its bed, and then sows his plot of ground, and after sowing turns his swine into it. The swine tread in the corn, after which he has only to await the harvest. The swine serve him also to thrash the grain, which is then carried to the garner. If, then, we choose to adopt the views of the Ionians concerning Egypt, we must come to the conclusion that the Egyptians had formerly no country at all. For the Ionians say that nothing is really Egypt but the delta, which extends along shore from the watchtower of Perseus, as it's called, to the Pelusiac salt pans, a distance of 40 skeins, and stretches inland as far as the city of Carcassonne, where the Nile divides into the two streams which reach the sea at Pelusium and Canobus, respectively. The rest of what's accounted Egypt belongs, they say, either to Arabia or Libya. But the delta, as the Egyptians affirm, and as I myself am persuaded, is formed of the deposits of the river, and has only recently, if I may use the expression, come to light. If then they had formerly no territory at all, how came they to be so extravagant as to fancy themselves the most ancient race in the world? Surely there was no need of their making the experiment with the children to see what language they would first speak. But in truth, I don't believe that the Egyptians came into being at the same time with the delta, as the Ionians call it. I think they've always existed ever since the human race began. As the land went on increasing, part of the population came down into the new country, part remained in their old settlements. In ancient times, the Thebes bore the name of Egypt, a district of which the entire circumference is but 6,120 furlongs. If then my judgment on these matters be right, the Ionians are mistaken in what they say of Egypt. If, on the contrary, it's they who are right, then I undertake to show that neither the Ionians nor any of the other Greeks know how to count, for they all say that the earth is divided into three parts, Europe, Asia, and Libya, whereas they ought to add a fourth part, the delta of Egypt, since they don't include it either in Asia or Libya. For is it not their theory that the Nile separates Asia from Libya? As the Nile therefore splits in two at the apex of the delta itself must be a separate country, not contained in either Asia or Libya. Here I take my leave of the opinions of the Ionians, and proceed to deliver my own sentiments on these subjects. I consider Egypt to be the whole country inhabited by the Egyptians, just as Cilicia is the tract occupied by the Cilicians, and Assyria that possessed by the Assyrians. And I regard the only proper boundary line between Libya and Asia to be that which is marked out by the Egyptian frontier. For if we take the boundary line commonly received by the Greeks, we must regard Egypt as divided along its whole length from Elephantine and the Cataracts to Carcassonne into two parts, each belonging to a different portion of the world, one to Asia, the other to Libya. Since the Nile divides Egypt in two from the Cataracts to the sea, running as far as the city of Carcassonne in a single stream, but at that point separating into three branches, whereof the one which bends eastward is called the Pelusiac mouth, and that which slants to the west the Canobic. Meanwhile, the straight course of the stream, which comes down from the upper country and meets the apex of the delta, continues on, dividing the delta down the middle, and carries as large a body of water as most of the others, the mouth called the Sebennytic. Besides these, there are two other mouths which run out of the Sebennytic, called respectively the Saitic and the Mendesian. The Bulbetine mouth and the Bucolic are not natural branches, but channels made by excavation. My judgment as to the extent of Egypt is confirmed by an oracle delivered at the shrine of Ammon, of which I had no knowledge at all until after I had formed my opinion. It happened that the people of the cities Maria and Apis, who live in the part of Egypt that borders on Libya, took a dislike to the religious usages of the country concerning sacrificial animals, and wished no longer to be restricted from eating the flesh of cows. So, as they believed themselves to be Libyans and not Egyptians, they sent to the shrine to say that, having nothing in common with the Egyptians, neither inhabiting the delta nor using the Egyptian tongue, they claimed to be allowed to eat whatever they pleased. Their request, however, was refused by the god, who declared in reply that Egypt was the entire tract of country which the Nile overspreads and irrigates, and the Egyptians were the people who lived below Elephantine and drank the waters of that river. So said the oracle. Now the Nile, when it overflows, floods not only the delta, but also the tracts of country on both sides the stream, which are thought to belong to Libya and Arabia, in some places reaching to the extent of 2 days' journey from its banks, and in some even exceeding that distance, but in others falling short of it. Concerning the nature of the river, I wasn't able to gain any information either from the priests or from others. I was particularly anxious to learn from them why the Nile, at the commencement of the summer solstice, begins to rise and continues to increase for 100 days, and why, as soon as that number is passed, it forthwith retires and contracts its stream, continuing low during the whole of the winter until the summer solstice comes round again. On none of these points could I obtain any explanation from the inhabitants, though I made every inquiry, wishing to know what was commonly reported. They could neither tell me what special virtue the Nile has, which makes it so opposite in its nature to all other streams, nor why, unlike every other river, it gives forth no breezes from its surface. Some of the Greeks, however, wishing to get a reputation for cleverness, have offered explanations of the phenomena of the river, for which they've accounted in 3 different ways. 2 of these I don't think it worthwhile to speak of, further than simply to mention what they are. One pretends that the Etesian winds cause the rise of the river by preventing the Nile water from running off into the sea. But in the first place, it has often happened, when the Etesian winds do not blow, that the Nile has risen according to its usual wont. And further, if the Etesian winds produced the effect, the other rivers which flow in a direction opposite to those winds ought to present the same phenomena as the Nile, and the more so as they're all smaller streams and have a weaker current. But these rivers, of which there are many both in Syria and Libya, are entirely unlike the Nile in this respect. The second opinion is even more unscientific than the one just mentioned, and also, if I may say so, more marvellous. It is that the Nile acts so strangely because it flows from the ocean, and that the ocean flows all round the earth. The third explanation, which is very much more plausible than either of the others, is positively the furthest from the truth, for there's really nothing in what it says any more than in the other theories. It is that the inundation of the Nile is caused by the melting of snows. Now, as the Nile flows out of Libya through Ethiopia into Egypt, how is it possible that it can be formed of melted snow, running as it does from the hottest regions of the world into cooler countries? Many are the proofs whereby anyone capable of reasoning on the subject may be convinced that it is most unlikely this should be the case. The first and strongest argument is furnished by the winds, which always blow hot from these regions. The second is that rain and frost are unknown there. Now, whenever snow falls, it must of necessity rain within 5 days, so that if there were snow, there must be rain also in those parts. Thirdly, it's certain that the natives of the country are black with the heat, that the kites and the swallows remain there the whole year, and that the cranes, when they fly from the rigours of a Scythian winter, flock thither to pass the cold season. If then in the country whence the Nile has its source, or in that through which it flows, there fell ever so little snow, it's absolutely impossible that any of these circumstances could take place. As for the writer who attributes the phenomenon to the ocean, his account is involved in such obscurity that it's impossible to disprove it by argument. For my part, I know of no river called Ocean, and I think that Homer, or one of the earlier poets, invented the name and introduced it into his poetry. Perhaps, after censoring all the opinions that have been put forward on this obscure subject, one ought to propose some theory of one's own. I'll therefore proceed to explain what I think to be the reason of the Nile's swelling in the summertime. During the winter, the sun is driven out of his usual course by the storms, and removes to the upper parts of Libya. This is the whole secret in the fewest possible words, for it stands to reason that the country to which the sun-god approaches the nearest, and which he passes most directly over, will be scantest of water, and that there the streams which feed the rivers will shrink the most. To explain, however, more at length, the case is this. The sun, in his passage across the upper parts of Libya, affects them in the following way. As the air in those regions is constantly clear, and the country warm through the absence of cold winds, the sun, in his passage across them, acts upon them exactly as he is wont to act elsewhere in summer, when his path is in the middle of heaven. That is, he attracts the water. After attracting it, he again repels it into the upper regions, where the winds lay hold of it, scatter it, and reduce it to a vapour, whence it naturally enough comes to pass that the winds which blow from this quarter, the south and southwest, are of all winds the most rainy. And my own opinion is that the sun does not get rid of all the water which he draws year by year from the Nile, but retains some about him. When the winter begins to soften, the sun goes back again to his old place in the middle of the heaven, and proceeds to attract water equally from all countries. Till then, the other rivers run big from the quantity of rainwater which they bring down from countries where so much moisture falls that all the land is cut into gullies. But in summer, when the showers fail and the sun attracts their water, they become low. The Nile, on the contrary, not deriving any of its bulk from rains, and being in winter subject to the attraction of the sun, naturally runs at that season, unlike all other streams, with a less burthen of water than in the summertime. For in summer it's exposed to attraction equally with all other rivers, but in winter it suffers alone. The sun, therefore, I regard as the sole cause of the phenomenon. It's the sun also, in my opinion, which, by heating the space through which it passes, makes the air in Egypt so dry. There is thus perpetual summer in the upper parts of Libya. Were the position of the heavenly regions reversed, so that the place where now the north wind and the winter have their dwelling became the station of the south wind and of the noonday, while on the other hand the station of the south wind became that of the north, the consequence would be that the sun, driven from the mid-heaven by the winter and the northern gales, would betake himself to the upper parts of Europe, as he now does to those of Libya. And then, I believe, his passage across Europe would affect the Ister exactly as the Nile is affected at the present day. And with respect to the fact that no breeze blows from the Nile, I am of opinion that no wind is likely to arise in very hot countries, for breezes love to blow from some cold quarter. Let's leave these things, however, to their natural course, to continue as they are and have been from the beginning. With regard to the sources of the Nile, I found no one among all those with whom I've conversed, whether Egyptians, Libyans, or Greeks, who professed to have any knowledge except a single person. He was the scribe who kept the register of the sacred treasures of Athena in the city of Sais, and he did not seem to me to be in earnest when he said that he knew them perfectly well. His story was as follows. Between Syene, a city of the Thebes, and the Elephantine, there are, he said, 2 hills with sharp conical tops. The name of the one is Crophi, of the other Mophi. Midway between them are the fountains of the Nile, fountains which it's impossible to fathom. Half the water runs northward into Egypt, half to the south towards Ethiopia. The fountains were known to be unfathomable, he declared, because Psammetichus, an Egyptian king, had made trial of them. He'd caused a rope to be made, many thousand fathoms in length, and had sounded the fountain with it, but could find no bottom. And by this the scribe gave me to understand, if there was any truth at all in what he said, that in this fountain there are certain strong eddies, and a regurgitation, owing to the force wherewith the water dashes against the mountains, and hence a sounding line cannot be got to reach the bottom of the spring. No other information on this head could I obtain from any quarter. All that I succeeded in learning further of the more distant portions of the Nile by ascending myself as high as Elephantine, and making inquiries concerning the parts beyond, was the following. As one advances beyond Elephantine, the land rises. Hence it's necessary in this part of the river to attach a rope to the boat on each side, as men harness an ox, and so proceed on the journey. If the rope snaps, the vessel is borne away downstream by the force of the current. The navigation continues the same for 4 days, the river winding greatly like the Meander, and the distance traversed amounting to 12 skeins. Here you come upon a smooth and level plain, where the Nile flows in 2 branches, round an island called Tecumseh. The country above Elephantine is inhabited by the Ethiopians, who possess 1/2 of this island, the Egyptians occupying the other. Above the island there's a great lake, the shores of which are inhabited by Ethiopian nomads. After passing it, you come again to the stream of the Nile, which runs into the lake. Here you land, and travel for 40 days along the banks of the river, since it's impossible to proceed further in a boat on account of the sharp peaks which jut out from the water and the sunken rocks which abound in that part of the stream. When you've passed this portion of the river in the space of 40 days, you go on board another boat and proceed by water for 12 days more, at the end of which time you reach a great city called Meroe, which is said to be the capital of the other Ethiopians. The only gods worshipped by the inhabitants are Zeus and Dionysus, to whom great honours are paid. There's an oracle of Zeus in the city, which directs the warlike expeditions of the Ethiopians. When it commands, they go to war, and in whatever direction it bids them march, thither straightway they carry their arms. On leaving this city, and again mounting the stream, in the same space of time which it took you to reach the capital from Elephantine, you come to the deserters, who bear the name of Asmach. This work, translated into our language, means the men who stand on the left hand of the king. These deserters are Egyptians of the warrior caste, who to the number of 240,000 went over to the Ethiopians in the reign of King Psammetichus. The cause of their desertion was the following. 3 garrisons were maintained in Egypt at that time, one in the city of Elephantine against the Ethiopians, another in the Pelusiac Daphne against the Syrians and Arabians, and a third against the Libyans in Maria. The very same posts are to this day occupied by the Persians, whose forces are in garrison both in Daphne and in Elephantine. Now it happened that on one occasion the garrisons were not relieved during the space of 3 years. The soldiers, therefore, at the end of that time consulted together, and having determined by common consent to revolt, marched away towards Ethiopia. Psammetichus, informed of the movement, set out in pursuit, and coming up with them, besought them with many words not to desert the gods of their country, nor abandon their wives and children. "Nay, but," said one of the deserters with an unseemly gesture, "wherever we go, we are sure enough of finding wives and children." Arrived in Ethiopia, they placed themselves at the disposal of the king. In return, he made them a present of a tract of land which belonged to certain Ethiopians with whom he was at feud, bidding them expel the inhabitants and take possession of their territory. From the time that this settlement was formed, their acquaintance with Egyptian manners has tended to civilize the Ethiopians. Thus, the course of the Nile is known not only throughout Egypt, but to the extent of 4 months' journey, either by land or water, above the Egyptian boundary. For on calculation it will be found that it takes that length of time to travel from Elephantine to the country of the deserters. There, the direction of the river is from west to east. Beyond, no one has any certain knowledge of its course, since the country is uninhabited by reason of the excessive heat. I did hear, indeed, what I'll now relate from certain natives of Cyrene. Once upon a time, they said, they were on a visit to the oracular shrine of Ammon, when it chanced that in the course of conversation with Antiochus, the Ammonian king, the talk fell upon the Nile, how that its sources were unknown to all men. Antiochus upon this mentioned that some Nasamonians had once come to his court, and when asked if they could give any information concerning the uninhabited parts of Libya, had told the following tale. The Nasamonians are a Libyan race who occupy the Syrtis and a tract of no great size towards the east. They said there had grown up among them some wild young men, the sons of certain chiefs, who when they came to man's estate indulged in all manner of extravagances, and among other things drew lots for 5 of their number to go and explore the desert parts of Libya, and try if they couldn't penetrate further than any had done previously. The coast of Libya along the sea, which washes it to the north throughout its entire length from Egypt to Cape Salois, which is its furthest point, is inhabited by Libyans of many distinct tribes who possess the whole tract except certain portions which belong to the Phoenicians and the Greeks. Above the coastline and the country inhabited by the maritime tribes, Libya is full of wild beasts, while beyond the wild beast region there's a tract which is wholly sand, very scant of water, and utterly and entirely a desert. The young men, therefore, dispatched on this errand by their comrades with a plentiful supply of water and provisions, travelled at first through the inhabited region, passing which they came to the wild beast tract, whence they finally entered upon the desert, which they proceeded to cross in a direction from east to west. After journeying for many days over a wide extent of sand, they came at last to a plain, where they observed trees growing. Approaching them, and seeing fruit on them, they proceeded to gather it. While they were thus engaged, there came upon them some dwarfish men, under the middle height, who seized them and carried them off. The Nasamonians couldn't understand a word of their language, nor had they any acquaintance with the language of the Nasamonians. They were led across extensive marshes, and finally came to a town where all the men were of the height of their conductors and black-complexioned. A great river flowed by the town, running from west to east, and containing crocodiles. Here let me dismiss Etearchus the Ammonian and his story, only adding that according to the Cyrenians, he declared that the Nasamonians got safe back to their country, and that the men whose city they had reached were a nation of sorcerers. With respect to the river which ran by their town, Etearchus conjectured it to be the Nile, and reason favours that view, for the Nile certainly flows out of Libya, dividing it down the middle, and as I conceive, judging the unknown from the known, rises at the same distance from its mouth as the Ister. This latter river has its source in the country of the Celts, near the city of Pyrene, and runs through the middle of Europe, dividing it into two portions. The Celts live beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and border on the Cynesians, who dwell at the extreme west of Europe. Thus the Ister flows through the whole of Europe before it finally empties itself into the Euxine at Istria, one of the colonies of the Milesians. Now, as this river flows through regions that are inhabited, its course is perfectly well known, but of the sources of the Nile no one can give any account, since Libya, the country through which it passes, is desert and without inhabitants. As far as it was possible to get information by inquiry, I have given a description of the stream. It enters Egypt from the parts beyond. Egypt lies almost exactly opposite the mountainous portion of Cilicia, whence a lightly equipped traveller may reach Sinope on the Euxine in 5 days by the direct route. Sinope lies opposite the place where the Ister falls into the sea. My opinion, therefore, is that the Nile, as it traverses the whole of Libya, is of equal length with the Ister. And here I take my leave of this subject. Concerning Egypt itself, I shall extend my remarks to a great length, because there is no country that possesses so many wonders, nor any that has such a number of works which defy description. Not only is the climate different from that of the rest of the world, and the rivers unlike any other rivers, but the people also, in most of their manners and customs, exactly reverse the common practice of mankind. The women attend to the markets and trade, while the men sit at home at the loom. And here, while the rest of the world works the woof up the wharf, the Egyptians work it down. The women likewise carry burthens upon their shoulders, while the men carry them upon their heads. The women urinate standing up, the men sitting down. They eat their food out of doors and in the streets, but retire for private purposes to their houses, giving as a reason that what is unseemly but necessary ought to be done in secret, but what has nothing unseemly about it should be done openly. A woman cannot serve the priestly office, either for god or goddess, but men are priests to both. Sons need not support their parents unless they choose, but daughters must, whether they choose or no. In other countries the priests have long hair. In Egypt their heads are shaven. Elsewhere it's customary in mourning for near relations to cut their hair close. The Egyptians, who wear no hair at any other time, when they lose a relative, let their beards and the hair of their heads grow long. All other men pass their lives separate from animals. The Egyptians have animals always living with them. Others make barley and wheat their food. It's a disgrace to do so in Egypt, where the grain they live on is spelt, which some call zia. Dough they knead with their feet, but they mix mud and even take up dung with their hands. They are the only people in the world, they at least, and such as have learnt the practice from them, who use circumcision. Their men wear 2 garments apiece, their women but one. They put on the rings and fasten the ropes to sails inside. Others put them outside. When they write or calculate, instead of going like the Greeks from left to right, they move their hand from right to left, and they insist, notwithstanding, that it's they who go to the right, and the Greeks who go to the left. They have two quite different kinds of writing, one of which is called sacred, the other common. They're religious to excess, far beyond any other race of men, and use the following ceremonies. They drink out of brazen cups, which they scour every day. There's no exception to this practice. They wear linen garments, which they're specially careful to have always fresh washed. They practice circumcision for the sake of cleanliness, considering it better to be cleanly than comely. The priests shave their whole body every other day, that no lice or other impure thing may adhere to them when they're engaged in the service of the gods. Their dress is entirely of linen, and their shoes of the papyrus plant. It isn't lawful for them to wear either dress or shoes of any other material. They bathe twice every day in cold water, and twice each night, besides which they observe, so to speak, thousands of ceremonies. They enjoy, however, not a few advantages. They consume none of their own property, but are at no expense for anything. But every day bread is baked for them of the sacred corn, and a plentiful supply of beef and of goose's flesh is assigned to each, and also a portion of wine made from the grape. Fish they're not allowed to eat, and beans, which none of the Egyptians ever sow or eat, if they come up of their own accord, either raw or boiled, the priests will not even endure to look on, since they consider it an unclean kind of pulse. Instead of a single priest, each god has the attendance of a college, at the head of which is a chief priest. When one of these dies, his son is appointed in his room. Male kine are reckoned to belong to Epaphus, and are therefore tested in the following manner. One of the priests appointed for the purpose searches to see if there is a single black hair on the whole body, since in that case the beast is unclean. He examines him all over, standing on his legs, and again laid upon his back, after which he takes the tongue out of his mouth, to see if it be clean in respect of the prescribed marks. What they are I'll mention elsewhere. He also inspects the hairs of the tail, to observe if they grow naturally. If the animal is pronounced clean in all these various points, the priest marks him by twisting a piece of papyrus round his horns, and attaching thereto some sealing clay, which he then stamps with his own signet ring. After this the beast is led away, and it's forbidden under the penalty of death to sacrifice an animal which has not been marked in this way. The following is their manner of sacrifice. They lead the victim, marked with their signet, to the altar, where they're about to offer it, and setting the wood alight, pour a libation of wine upon the altar in front of the victim, and at the same time invoke the god. Then they slay the animal, and cutting off his head, proceed to flay the body. Next they take the head, and heaping imprecations on it, if there's a marketplace and a body of Greek traders in the city, they carry it there and sell it instantly. If, however, there are no Greeks among them, they throw the head into the river. The imprecation is to this effect. They pray that if any evil is impending, either over those who sacrifice or over universal Egypt, it may be made to fall upon that head. These practices, the imprecations upon the heads and the libations of wine, prevail all over Egypt, and extend to victims of all sorts, and hence the Egyptians will never eat the head of any animal. The disemboweling and burning are, however, different in different sacrifices. I'll mention the mode in use with respect to the goddess whom they regard as the greatest, and honour with the chiefest festival. When they've flayed their steer, they pray. and when their prayer is ended, they take the paunch of the animal out entire, leaving the intestines and the fat inside the body. They then cut off the legs, the ends of the loins, the shoulders, and the neck, and having so done, they fill the body of the steer with clean bread, honey, raisins, figs, frankincense, myrrh, and other aromatics. Thus filled, they burn the body, pouring over it great quantities of oil. Before offering the sacrifice, they fast, and while the bodies of the victims are being consumed, they beat themselves. Afterwards, when they've concluded this part of the ceremony, they have the other parts of the victim served up to them for a repast. The male kine, therefore, if clean, and the male calves, are used for sacrifice by the Egyptians universally, but the females they are not allowed to sacrifice, since they are sacred to Isis. The statue of this goddess has the form of a woman, but with horns like a cow, resembling thus the Greek representations of Io. And the Egyptians, one and all, venerate cows much more highly than any other animal. This is the reason why no native of Egypt, whether man or woman, will give a Greek a kiss, or use the knife of a Greek, or his spit, or his cauldron, or taste the flesh of an ox, known to be pure, if it has been cut with a Greek knife. When kine die, the following is the manner of their sepulture. The females are thrown into the river. The males are buried in the suburbs of the towns, with one or both of their horns appearing above the surface of the ground, to mark the place. When the bodies are decayed, a boat comes, at an appointed time, from the island called Prosopitis, which is a portion of the delta 9 skeins in circumference, and calls at the several cities in order to collect the bones of the oxen. Prosopitis is a district containing several cities. The name of that from which the boats come is Atarbekis. Aphrodite has a temple there of much sanctity. Great numbers of men go forth from this city and proceed to the other towns, where they dig up the bones, which they take away with them and bury together in one place. The same practice prevails with respect to the interment of all other cattle. The law so determining, they do not slaughter any of them. Such Egyptians as possess a temple of the Theban Jove, or live in the Thebaic canton, offer no sheep in sacrifice, but only goats. For the Egyptians don't all worship the same gods, excepting Isis and Osiris, the latter of whom they say is the Grecian Dionysus. Those, on the contrary, who possess a temple dedicated to Mendes, or belong to the Mendesian canton, abstain from offering goats and sacrifice sheep instead. The Thebans, and such as imitate them in their practice, give the following account of the origin of the custom. Heracles, they say, wished of all things to see Jove, but Jove didn't choose to be seen of him. At length, when Heracles persisted, Jove hit on a device to flay a ram, and cutting off his head, hold the head before him and cover himself with the fleece. In this guise he showed himself to Heracles. Therefore the Egyptians give their statues of Zeus the face of a ram, and from them the practice has passed to the Ammonians, who are a joint colony of Egyptians and Ethiopians, speaking a language between the two. Hence also, in my opinion, the latter people took their name of Ammonians, since the Egyptian name for Zeus is Amun. Such then is the reason why the Thebans do not sacrifice rams, but consider them sacred animals. Upon one day in the year, however, at the festival of Zeus, they slay a single ram, and stripping off the fleece, cover with it the statue of that god, as he once covered himself, and then bring up to the statue of Jove an image of Heracles. When this has been done, the whole assembly beat their breasts in mourning for the ram, and afterwards bury him in a holy sepulchre. The account which I received of this Heracles makes him one of the 12 gods. Of the other Heracles, with whom the Greeks are familiar, I could hear nothing in any part of Egypt. That the Greeks, however, those I mean who gave the son of Amphitryon that name, took the name from the Egyptians, and not the Egyptians from the Greeks, is, I think, clearly proved, among other arguments, by the fact that both the parents of Heracles, Amphitryon, as well as Alcmena, were of Egyptian origin. Again, the Egyptians disclaim all knowledge of the names of Poseidon and the Dioscuri, and do not include them in the number of their gods. But had they adopted the name of any god from the Greeks, these would have been the likeliest to obtain notice, since the Egyptians, as I am well convinced, practised navigation at that time, and the Greeks also were some of them mariners, so that they would have been more likely to know the names of these gods than that of Heracles. But the Egyptian Heracles is one of their ancient gods. 17,000 years before the reign of Amasis, the 12 gods were, they affirm, produced from the 8, and of these 12, Heracles is one. In the wish to get the best information that I could on these matters, I made a voyage to Tyre in Phoenicia, hearing there was a temple of Heracles in that place, very highly venerated. I visited the temple, and found it richly adorned with a number of offerings, among which were 2 pillars, one of pure gold, the other of emerald, shining with great brilliancy at night. In a conversation which I held with the priests, I inquired how long their temple had been built, and found by their answer that they too differed from the Greeks. They said that the temple was built at the same time that the city was founded, and that the foundation of the city took place 2,300 years ago. In Tyre I remarked another temple where the same god was worshipped as the Thasian Heracles, so I went on to Thasos, where I found a temple of Heracles which had been built by the Phoenicians who colonized that island when they sailed in search of Euterpe. Even this was 5 generations earlier than the time when Heracles, son of Amphitryon, was born in Greece. These researches show plainly that there is an ancient god, Heracles, and my own opinion is that those Greeks act most wisely who build and maintain 2 temples of Heracles, in the one of which the Heracles worshipped is known by the name of Olympian, and has sacrifice offered to him as an immortal, while in the other the honours paid are such as are due to a hero. The Greeks tell many tales without due investigation, and among them the following silly fable respecting Heracles. Heracles, they say, went once to Egypt, and there the inhabitants took him, and putting a chaplet on his head, led him out in solemn procession, intending to offer him a sacrifice to Zeus. For a while he submitted quietly, but when they led him up to the altar and began the ceremonies, he put forth his strength and slew them all. Now to me it seems that such a story proves the Greeks to be utterly ignorant of the character and customs of the people. The Egyptians do not think it allowable even to sacrifice cattle, excepting sheep and the male kine and calves, provided they be pure, and also geese. How then can it be believed that they would sacrifice men? And again, how would it have been possible for Heracles alone, and, as they confess, a mere mortal, to destroy so many thousands? In saying thus much concerning these matters, may I incur no displeasure, either of God or hero. I mentioned above that some of the Egyptians abstain from sacrificing goats, either male or female. The reason is the following. These Egyptians, who are the Mendesians, consider Pan to be one of the 8 gods who existed before the 12, and Pan is represented in Egypt by the painters and the sculptors, just as he is in Greece, with the face and legs of a goat. They don't, however, believe this to be his shape, or consider him in any respect unlike the other gods, but they represent him thus for a reason which I prefer not to relate. The Mendesians hold all goats in veneration, but the male more than the female, giving the goatherds of the males especial honour. One is venerated more highly than all the rest, and when he dies there's a great mourning throughout all the Mendesian canton. In Egyptian, The goat and Pan are both called Mendes. A marvel occurred in my time in this canton, a goat coupled openly with a woman in full view. This was done as a public exhibition. The pig is regarded among them as an unclean animal, so much so that if a man in passing accidentally touch a pig, he instantly hurries to the river and plunges in with all his clothes on. Hence too the swineherds, notwithstanding that they are of pure Egyptian blood, are forbidden to enter into any of the temples which are open to all other Egyptians. And further, no one will give his daughter in marriage to a swineherd, or take a wife from among them, so that the swineherds are forced to intermarry among themselves. They don't offer swine in sacrifice to any of their gods except Dionysus and the moon, whom they honour in this way at the same time, sacrificing pigs to both of them at the same full moon, and afterwards eating of the flesh. There is a reason alleged by them for their detestation of swine at all other seasons, and of their use of them at this festival, with which I am well acquainted, but which I don't think it proper to mention. The following is the mode in which they sacrifice the swine to the moon. As soon as the victim is slain, the tip of the tail, the spleen, and the caul are put together, and having been covered with all the fat that has been found in the animal's belly, are straightway burnt. The remainder of the flesh is eaten on the same day that the sacrifice is offered, which is the day of the full moon. At any other time they would not so much as taste it. The poorer sort, who can't afford live pigs, form pigs of dough, which they bake and offer in sacrifice. To Dionysus, on the eve of his feast, every Egyptian sacrifices a hog before the door of his house, which is then given back to the swineherd by whom it was furnished, and by him carried away. In other respects, the festival is celebrated almost exactly as Dionysiac festivals are in Greece, excepting that the Egyptians have no choral dances. They also use, instead of phalli, another invention consisting of images a cubit high, pulled by strings, which the women carry round to the villages. The genitals nod up and down, and are almost as large as the rest of the body. A piper goes in front, and the women follow, singing hymns in honour of Dionysus. They give a religious story for why the genitals are larger and the only movable part of the body. Melampus, the son of Amethion, cannot, I think, have been ignorant of this ceremony. Nay, he must, I should conceive, have been well acquainted with it. He it was who introduced into Greece the name of Dionysus, the ceremonial of his worship, and the procession of the phallus. He didn't, however, so completely apprehend the whole doctrine as to be able to communicate it entirely, but various sages since his time have carried out his teaching to greater perfection. Still, it's certain that Melampus introduced the phallus, and that the Greeks learned from him the ceremonies which they now practice. I therefore maintain that Melampus, who was a wise man, and had acquired the art of divination, having become acquainted with the worship of Dionysus through knowledge derived from Egypt, introduced it into Greece with a few slight changes, at the same time that he brought in various other practices. For I can by no means allow that it is by mere coincidence that the Dionysiac ceremonies in Greece are so nearly the same as the Egyptian. They would then have been more Greek in their character and less recent in their origin. Much less can I admit that the Egyptians borrowed these customs, or any other, from the Greeks. My belief is that Melampus got his knowledge of them from Cadmus the Tyrian, and the followers whom he brought from Phoenicia into the country which is now called Boeotia. Almost all the names of the gods came into Greece from Egypt. My inquiries proved that they were all derived from a foreign source, and my opinion is that Egypt furnished the greater number. For with the exception of Poseidon and the Dioscuri, whom I mentioned above, and Hera, Hestia, Themis, the Graces, and the Nereids, The other gods have been known from time immemorial in Egypt. This I assert on the authority of the Egyptians themselves. The gods with whose names they profess themselves unacquainted, the Greeks received, I believe, from the Pelasgi, except Poseidon. Of him they got their knowledge from the Libyans, by whom he has been always honoured, and who were anciently the only people that had a god of the name. The Egyptians differ from the Greeks also in paying no divine honours to heroes. Besides these which have been here mentioned, there are many other practices whereof I shall speak hereafter, which the Greeks have borrowed from Egypt. However, the fashioning of statues of Hermes with the genitals erect, they learnt not from the Egyptians, but from the Pelasgi. From them the Athenians first adopted it, and afterwards it passed from the Athenians to the other Greeks. For just at the time when the Athenians were entering into the Hellenic body, the Pelasgi came to live with them in their country, whence it was that the latter came first to be regarded as Greeks. Whoever has been initiated into the mysteries of the Kabiri will understand what I mean. The Samothracians received these mysteries from the Pelasgi, who, before they went to live in Attica, were dwellers in Samothrace, and imparted their religious ceremonies to the inhabitants. The Athenians, then, who were the first of all the Greeks to make their statues of Hermes with genitals erect, learnt the practice from the Pelasgians, and by this people a religious account of the matter is given, which is explained in the Samothracian mysteries. In early times, the Pelasgi, as I know by information which I got at Dodona, offered sacrifices of all kinds and prayed to the gods, but had no distinct names or appellations for them, since they had never heard of any. They called them gods, theoi, disposers, because they had disposed and arranged all things in such a beautiful order. After a long lapse of time, the names of the gods came to Greece from Egypt, and the Pelasgi learnt them, only as yet they knew nothing of Dionysus, of whom they first heard at a much later date. Not long after the arrival of the names, they sent to consult the oracle at Dodona about them. This is the most ancient oracle in Greece, and at that time there was no other. To their question whether they should adopt the names that had been imported from the foreigners, the oracle replied by recommending their use. Thenceforth, in their sacrifices, the Pelasgi made use of the names of the gods, but from them the names passed afterwards to the Greeks. Whether the gods severally sprang, whether or no they had all existed from eternity, what forms they bore, these are questions of which the Greeks knew nothing until the other day, so to speak. For Homer and Hesiod were the first to compose theogonies and to give the gods their epithets, to allot them their several offices and occupations, and describe their forms. And they lived but 400 years before my time, as I believe. As for the poets, who are thought by some to be earlier than these, they are, in my judgment, decidedly later writers. In these matters I have the authority of the priestesses of Dodona for the former portion of my statements. What I've said of Homer and Hesiod is my own opinion. The following tale is commonly told in Egypt concerning the oracle of Dodona in Greece, and that of Ammon in Libya. My informants on the point were the priests of Zeus at Thebes. They said that 2 of the sacred women were once carried off from Thebes by the Phoenicians, and that the story went that one of them was sold into Libya and the other into Greece, and these women were the first founders of the oracles in the 2 countries. On my inquiring how they came to know so exactly what became of the women, they answered that a diligent search had been made after them at the time, but that it hadn't been found possible to discover where they were. Afterwards, however, they received the information which they'd given me. This was what I heard from the priests at Thebes. At Dodona, however, the women who deliver the oracles relate the matter as follows. 2 black doves flew away from Egyptian Thebes, and while one directed its flight to Libya, the other came to them. She alighted on an oak, and sitting there began to speak with a human voice, and told them that on the spot where she was there should thenceforth be an oracle of Jove. They understood the announcement to be from heaven, so they set to work at once and erected the shrine. The dove which flew to Libya bade the Libyans to establish there the oracle of Ammon. This likewise is an oracle of Zeus. The persons from whom I received these particulars were 3 priestesses of the Dodonaeans, the eldest Promenea, the next Timarete, and the youngest Nicandra. What they said was confirmed by the other Dodonaeans who dwell around the temple. My own opinion of these matters is as follows. I think that if it be true that the Phoenicians carried off the holy women and sold them for slaves, the one into Libya and the other into Greece, or Pelasgia as it was then called, this last must have been sold to the Thesprotians. Afterwards, while undergoing servitude in those parts, she built under a real oak a temple to Zeus, her thoughts in her new abode reverting, as it was likely they would do if she had been an attendant in a temple of Zeus at Thebes, to that particular god. Then, having acquired a knowledge of the Greek tongue, she set up an oracle. She also mentioned that her sister had been sold for a slave into Libya by the same persons as herself. The Dodonaeans called the women doves because they were foreigners, and seemed to them to make a noise like birds. After a while the dove spoke with a human voice, because the woman whose foreign talk had previously sounded to them like the chattering of a bird acquired the power of speaking what they could understand. For how can it be conceived possible that a dove should really speak with the voice of a man? Lastly, by calling the dove black, the Dodonaeans indicated that the woman was an Egyptian, and certainly the character of the oracles at Thebes and Dodona is very similar. Besides this form of divination, the Greeks learnt also divination by means of victims from the Egyptians. The Egyptians were also the first to introduce solemn assemblies, processions, and litanies to the gods, of all which the Greeks were taught the use by them. It seems to me a sufficient proof of this that in Egypt these practices have been established from remote antiquity, while in Greece they are only recently known. The Egyptians do not hold a single solemn assembly, but several in the course of the year. Of these, the chief, which is better attended than any other, is held at the city of Bubastis, in honour of Artemis. The next in importance is that which takes place at Busiris, a city situated in the very middle of the delta. It's in honour of Isis, who is called in the Greek tongue Demeter, Ceres. There's a third great festival in Sais to Athena, a fourth in Heliopolis to the sun, a fifth in Buto to Leto, and a sixth in Paprimis to Ares. The following are the proceedings on occasion of the assembly at Bubastis. Men and women come sailing all together, vast numbers in each boat, many of the women with castanets which they strike, while some of the men pipe during the whole time of the voyage. The remainder of the voyagers, male and female, sing the while and make a clapping with their hands. When they arrive opposite any of the towns upon the banks of the stream, they approach the shore, and while some of the women continue to play and sing, others call aloud to the females of the place and load them with abuse, while a certain number dance, and some, standing up, uncover themselves. After proceeding in this way all along the river course, they reach Bubastis, where they celebrate the feast with abundant sacrifices. More grape wine is consumed at this festival than in all the rest of the year besides. The number of those who attend, counting only the men and women and omitting the children, amounts, according to the native reports, to 700,000. The ceremonies at the feast of Isis in the city of Busiris have been already spoken of. It's there that the whole multitude, both of men and women, many thousands in number, beat themselves at the close of the sacrifice in honour of a god whose name a religious scruple forbids me to mention. The Carian dwellers in Egypt proceed on this occasion to still greater lengths, even cutting their faces with their knives, whereby they let it be seen that they are not Egyptians but foreigners. At Sais, when the assembly takes place for the sacrifices, there's one night on which the inhabitants all burn a multitude of lights in the open air round their houses. They use lamps in the shape of flat saucers filled with a mixture of oil and salt, on the top of which the wick floats. These burn the whole night, and give to the festival the name of the Feast of Lamps. The Egyptians who are absent from the festival observe the night of the sacrifice no less than the rest by a general lighting of lamps, so that the illumination is not confined to the city of Sais, but extends over the whole of Egypt. And there's a religious reason assigned for the special honor paid to this night, as well as for the illumination which accompanies it. At Heliopolis and Buto the assemblies are merely for the purpose of sacrifice, but at Paprimis, besides the sacrifices and other rites which are performed there as elsewhere, the following custom is observed. When the sun is getting low, a few only of the priests continue occupied about the image of the god, while the greater number, armed with wooden clubs, take their station at the portal of the temple. Opposite to them is drawn up a body of men in number above 1,000, armed like the others with clubs, consisting of persons engaged in the performance of their vows. The image of the god, which is kept in a small wooden shrine covered with plates of gold, is conveyed from the temple into a second sacred building the day before the festival begins. The few priests still in attendance upon the image place it, together with the shrine containing it, on a four-wheeled car, and begin to drag it along. The others, stationed at the gateway of the temple, oppose its admission. Then the votaries come forward to espouse the quarrel of the god, and set upon the opponents, who are sure to offer resistance. A sharp fight with clubs ensues, in which heads are commonly broken on both sides. Many, I'm convinced, die of the wounds that they receive, though the Egyptians insist that no one is ever killed. The natives give the subjoined account of this festival. They say that the mother of the god Ares once dwelt in the temple. Brought up at a distance from his parent, when he grew to man's estate he conceived a wish to visit her. Accordingly he came, but the attendants, who had never seen him before, refused him entrance, and succeeded in keeping him out. So he went to another city and collected a body of men with whose aid he handled the attendants very roughly, and forced his way in to his mother. Hence, they say, arose the custom of a fight with sticks in honor of Ares at this festival. The Egyptians first made it a point of religion to have no converse with women in the sacred places, and not to enter them without washing after such converse. Almost all other nations, except the Greeks and the Egyptians, do have converse in temples, and enter temples unwashed after lying with a woman, regarding man, as in this matter, under no other law than the brutes. Many animals, they say, and various kinds of birds may be seen to couple in the temples and the sacred precincts, which would certainly not happen if the gods were displeased at it. Such are the arguments by which they defend their practice, but I nevertheless can by no means approve of it. In these points the Egyptians are specially careful, and they are indeed in everything which concerns their sacred edifices. Egypt, though it borders upon Libya, is not a region abounding in wild animals. The animals that do exist in the country, whether domesticated or otherwise, are all regarded as sacred. If I were to explain why they are consecrated to the several gods, I should be led to speak of religious matters, which I particularly shrink from mentioning. The points whereon I have touched slightly hitherto have all been introduced from sheer necessity. Their custom with respect to animals is as follows. For every kind there are appointed certain guardians, some male, some female, whose business it is to look after them, and this honour is made to descend from father to son. The inhabitants of the various cities, when they've made a vow to any god, pay it to his animals in the way which I'll now explain. At the time of making the vow, they shave the head of the child, cutting off all the hair, or else half, or sometimes a third part, which they then weigh in a balance against a sum of silver. and whatever sum the hare weighs is presented to the guardian of the animals, who thereupon cuts up some fish and gives it to them for food, such being the stuff whereon they're fed. When a man has killed one of the sacred animals, if he did it with malice prepense, he's punished with death. If unwittingly, he has to pay such a fine as the priests choose to impose. When an ibis, however, or a hawk is killed, whether it was done by accident or on purpose, the man must needs die. The number of domestic animals in Egypt is very great, and would be still greater were it not for what befalls the cats. As the females, when they've kittened, no longer seek the company of the males, these last, to obtain once more their companionship, practice a curious artifice. They seize the kittens, carry them off, and kill them, but do not eat them afterwards. Upon this, the females, being deprived of their young, and longing to supply their place, seek the males once more, since they are particularly fond of their offspring. On every occasion of a fire in Egypt, the strangest prodigy occurs with the cats. The inhabitants allow the fire to rage as it pleases, while they stand about at intervals and watch these animals, which, slipping by the men or else leaping over them, rush headlong into the flames. When this happens, the Egyptians are in deep affliction. If a cat dies in a private house by a natural death, all the inmates of the house shave their eyebrows. On the death of a dog, they shave the head and the whole of the body. The cats, on their decease, are taken to the city of Bubastis, where they're embalmed, after which they're buried in certain sacred repositories. The dogs are interred in the cities to which they belong, also in sacred burial places. The same practice obtains with respect to the ichneumons. The hawks and shrew mice, on the contrary, are conveyed to the city of Buto for burial, and the ibises to Hermopolis. The bears, which are scarce in Egypt, and the wolves, which aren't much bigger than foxes, they bury wherever they happen to find them lying. The following are the peculiarities of the crocodile. During the 4 winter months they eat nothing. They are 4-footed and live indifferently on land or in the water. The female lays and hatches her eggs ashore, passing the greater portion of the day on dry land, but at night retiring to the river, the water of which is warmer than the night air and the dew. Of all known animals, this is the one which, from the smallest size, grows to be the greatest. For the egg of the crocodile is but little bigger than that of the goose, and the young crocodile is in proportion to the egg. Yet when it's full grown, the animal measures frequently 17 cubits and even more. It has the eyes of a pig, teeth large and tusk-like, of a size proportioned to its frame. Unlike any other animal, it's without a tongue. It can't move its under jaw, and in this respect, too, it's singular, being the only animal in the world which moves the upper jaw, but not the under. It has strong claws and a scaly skin, impenetrable upon the back. In the water it's blind, but on land it's very keen of sight. As it lives chiefly in the river, it has the inside of its mouth constantly covered with leeches. Hence it happens that while all the other birds and beasts avoid it, with the trochilus it lives at peace, since it owes much to that bird. For the crocodile, when he leaves the water and comes out upon the land, is in the habit of lying with his mouth wide open, facing the western breeze. At such times the trochilus goes into his mouth and devours the leeches. This benefits the crocodile, who is pleased, and takes care not to hurt the trochilus. The crocodile is esteemed sacred by some of the Egyptians, by others he is treated as an enemy. Those who live near Thebes and those who dwell around Lake Moeris regard them with especial veneration. In each of these places they keep one crocodile in particular, who is taught to be tame and tractable. They adorn his ears with earrings of molten stone or gold, and put bracelets on his forepaws, giving him daily a set portion of bread with a certain number of victims, and after having thus treated him with the greatest possible attention while alive, they embalm him when he dies, and bury him in a sacred repository. The people of Elephantine, on the other hand, are so far from considering these animals as sacred that they even eat their flesh. In the Egyptian language, they're not called crocodiles, but Kampse. The name of crocodiles was given them by the Ionians, who remarked their resemblance to the lizards which in Ionia live in the walls and are called crocodiles. The modes of catching the crocodile are many and various. I shall only describe the one which seems to me most worthy of attention. They bait a hook with a chine of pork and let the meat be carried out into the middle of the stream, while the hunter upon the bank holds a living pig, which he belabours. The crocodile hears its cries, and making for the sound, encounters the pork, which he instantly swallows down. The men on the shore haul when they've got him to land. The first thing the hunter does is to plaster his eyes with mud. This once accomplished, the animal is dispatched with ease, otherwise he gives great trouble. The hippopotamus in the canton of Paprimis is a sacred animal, but not in any other part of Egypt. It may be thus described. It's a quadruped, cloven-footed, with hoofs like an ox and a flat nose. It has the mane and tail of a horse, huge tusks which are very conspicuous, and a voice like a horse's neigh. In size it equals the biggest oxen, and its skin is so tough that when dried it's made into javelins. Otters also are found in the Nile and are considered sacred. Only two sorts of fish are venerated, that called the Lepidotus and the eel. These are regarded as sacred to the Nile, as likewise among birds is the valpanza or fox goose. They have also another sacred bird called the phoenix, which I myself have never seen except in pictures. Indeed, it's a great rarity even in Egypt, only coming there, according to the accounts of the people of Heliopolis, once in 500 years, when the old phoenix dies. Its size and appearance, if it's like the pictures, are as follows. The plumage is partly red, partly golden, while the general make and size are almost exactly that of the eagle. They tell a story of what this bird does, which doesn't seem to me to be credible, that he comes all the way from Arabia and brings the parent bird, all plastered over with myrrh, to the temple of the sun, and there buries the body. In order to bring him, they say, he first forms a ball of myrrh as big as he finds that he can carry. Then he hollows out the ball and puts his parent inside, after which he covers over the opening with fresh myrrh, and the ball is then of exactly the same weight as at first. So he brings it to Egypt, plastered over, as I've said, and deposits it in the temple of the sun. Such is the story they tell of the doings of this bird. In the neighbourhood of Thebes there are some sacred serpents, which are perfectly harmless. They're of small size and have two horns growing out of the top of the head. These snakes, when they die, are buried in the temple of Zeus, the god to whom they're sacred. I went once to a certain place in Arabia, almost exactly opposite the city of Buto, to make inquiries concerning the winged serpents. On my arrival I saw the backbones and ribs of serpents in such numbers that it's impossible to describe. Of the ribs there were a multitude of heaps, some great, some small, some middle-sized. The place where the bones lie is at the entrance of a narrow gorge between steep mountains, which there open upon a spacious plain communicating with the great plain of Egypt. The story goes that with the spring the winged snakes come flying from Arabia towards Egypt, but are met in this gorge by the birds called ibises, who forbid their entrance and destroy them all. The Arabians assert, and the Egyptians also admit, that it's on account of the service thus rendered that the Egyptians hold the ibis in so much reverence. The ibis is a bird of a deep black colour, with legs like a crane. Its beak is strongly hooked, and its size is about that of the landrail. This is a description of the black ibis which contends with the serpents. The commoner sort, for there are two quite distinct species, has the head and the whole throat bare of feathers. Its general plumage is white, but the head and neck are jet black, as also are the tips of the wings and the extremity of the tail. In its beak and legs it resembles the other species. The winged serpent is shaped like the water snake. Its wings are not feathered, but resemble very closely those of the bat. And thus I conclude the subject of the sacred animals. With respect to the Egyptians themselves, it's to be remarked that those who live in the corn country, devoting themselves as they do far more than any other people in the world to the preservation of the memory of past actions, are the best skilled in history of any men that I've ever met. The following is the mode of life habitual to them. For 3 successive days in each month they purge the body by means of emetics and clysters, which is done out of a regard for their health, since they have a persuasion that every disease to which men are liable is occasioned by the substances whereon they feed. Apart from any such precautions, they are, I believe, next to the Libyans, the healthiest people in the world, an effect of their climate, in my opinion, which has no sudden changes. Diseases almost always attack men when they're exposed to a change, and never more than during changes of the weather. They live on bread made of spelt, which they form into loaves, called in their own tongue celestis. Their drink is a wine which they obtain from barley, as they have no vines in their country. Many kinds of fish they eat raw, either salted or dried in the sun. Quails also, and ducks and small birds they eat uncooked, merely first salting them. All other birds and fishes, excepting those which are set apart as sacred, are eaten either roasted or boiled. In social meetings among the rich, when the banquet is ended, a servant carries round to the several guests a coffin, in which there's a wooden image of a corpse, carved and painted to resemble nature as nearly as possible, about a cubit or 2 cubits in length. As he shows it to each guest in turn, the servant says, "Gaze here, and drink and be merry, for when you die, such will you be." The Egyptians adhere to their own national customs and adopt no foreign usages. Many of these customs are worthy of note. Among others, their song, the Linus, which is sung under various names, not only in Egypt but in Phoenicia, in Cyprus, and in other places, and which seems to be exactly the same as that in use among the Greeks, and by them called Linus. There were very many things in Egypt which filled me with astonishment, and this was one of them. Whence could the Egyptians have got the Linus? It appears to have been sung by them from the very earliest times. For the Linus in Egyptian is called Maneros, and they told me that Maneros was the only son of their first king, and that on his untimely death he was honoured by the Egyptians with these dirge-like strains, and in this way they got their first and only melody. There's another custom in which the Egyptians resemble a particular Greek people, namely the Lacedaemonians. Their young men, when they meet their elders in the streets, give way to them and step aside. And if an elder come in where young men are present, these latter rise from their seats. In a third point, they differ entirely from all the nations of Greece. Instead of speaking to each other when they meet in the streets, they make an obeisance, sinking the hand to the knee. They wear a linen tunic, fringed about the legs, and called calasiris. Over this they have a white woolen garment thrown on afterwards. Nothing of woolen, however, is taken into their temples or buried with them, as their religion forbids it. Here their practice resembles the rites called Orphic and Dionysiac, but which are in reality Egyptian and Pythagorean, for no one initiated in these mysteries can be buried in a woolen shroud, a religious reason being assigned for the observance. The Egyptians likewise discovered to which of the gods each month and day is sacred, and found out from the day of a man's birth what he will meet with in the course of his life, and how he will end his days, and what sort of man he will be, discoveries whereof the Greeks engaged in poetry have made a use. The Egyptians have also discovered more prognostics than all the rest of mankind besides. Whenever a prodigy takes place, they watch and record the result. Then, if anything similar ever happens again, they expect the same consequences. With respect to divination, they hold that it's a gift which no mortal possesses, but only certain of the gods. Thus they have an oracle of Heracles, one of Apollo, of Athena, of Artemis, of Ares, and of Zeus. Besides these, there's the oracle of Leto at Buto, which is held in much higher repute than any of the rest. The mode of delivering the oracles is not uniform, but varies at the different shrines. Medicine is practiced amongst them on a plan of separation. Each physician treats a single disorder and no more. Thus the country swarms with medical practitioners, some undertaking to cure diseases of the eye, others of the head, others again of the teeth, others of the intestines, and some of those which are not local. The following is the way in which they conduct their mournings and their funerals. On the death in any house of a man of consequence, forthwith the women of the family beplaster their heads, and sometimes even their faces, with mud, and then, leaving the body indoors, sally forth and wander through the city, with their dress fastened by a band, and their bosoms bare, beating themselves as they walk. All the female relations join them and do the same. The men, too, similarly begirt, beat their breasts separately. When these ceremonies are over, the body is carried away to be embalmed. There are a set of men in Egypt who practice the art of embalming and make it their proper business. These persons, when a body is brought to them, show the bearers various models of corpses made in wood and painted so as to resemble nature. The most perfect is said to be after the manner of him whom I do not think it religious to name in connection with such a matter. The second sort is inferior to the first and less costly. The third is the cheapest of all. All this the embalmers explain, and then ask in which way it's wished that the corpse should be prepared. The bearers tell them, and having concluded their bargain, take their departure, while the embalmers, left to themselves, proceed to their task. The mode of embalming, according to the most perfect process, is the following. They take first a crooked piece of iron, and with it draw out the brain through the nostrils, thus getting rid of a portion, while the skull is cleared of the rest by rinsing with drugs. Next they make a cut along the flank with a sharp Ethiopian stone, and take out the whole contents of the abdomen, which they then cleanse, washing it thoroughly with palm wine, and again frequently with an infusion of pounded aromatics. After this they fill the cavity with the purest bruised myrrh, with cassia and every other sort of spicery, except frankincense, and sew up the opening. Then the body is placed in natrum for 70 days and covered entirely over. After the expiration of that space of time, which mustn't be exceeded, the body is washed and wrapped round from head to foot with bandages of fine linen cloth, smeared over with gum, which is used generally by the Egyptians in the place of glue, and in this state it's given back to the relations, who enclose it in a wooden case which they've had made for the purpose, shaped into the figure of a man. Then, fastening the case, they place it in a sepulchral chamber upright against the wall. Such is the most costly way of embalming the dead. If persons wish to avoid expense and choose the second process, the following is the method pursued. Syringes are filled with oil made from the cedar tree, which is then, without any incision or disemboweling, injected into the abdomen. The passage by which it might be likely to return is stopped, and the body laid in natrum the prescribed number of days. At the end of the time, the cedar oil is allowed to make its escape, and such is its power that it brings with it the whole stomach and intestines in a liquid state. The natrum, meanwhile, has dissolved the flesh, and so nothing is left of the dead body but the skin and the bones. It's returned in this condition to the relatives without any further trouble being bestowed upon it. The third method of embalming, which is practiced in the case of the poorer classes, is to clear out the intestines with a clyster and let the body lie in natrum the 70 days, after which it's at once given to those who come to fetch it away. The wives of men of rank are not given to be embalmed immediately after death, nor indeed are any of the more beautiful and valued women. It's not till they've been dead 3 or 4 days that they're carried to the embalmers. This is done to prevent indignities from being offered them. It's said that once a case of this kind occurred, the man was detected by the information of his fellow workmen. Whensoever anyone, Egyptian or foreigner, has lost his life by falling a prey to a crocodile or by drowning in the river, the law compels the inhabitants of the city near which the body is cast up to have it embalmed and to bury it in one of the sacred repositories with all possible magnificence. No one may touch the corpse, not even any of the friends or relatives, but only the priests of the Nile, who prepare it for burial with their own hands, regarding it as something more than the mere body of a man, and to themselves lay it in the tomb. The Egyptians are averse to adopt Greek customs, or, in a word, those of any other nation. This feeling is almost universal among them. At Chemis, however, which is a large city in the Thebaic canton near Neapolis, there's a square enclosure sacred to Perseus, son of Danae. Palm trees grow all round the place, which has a stone gateway of an unusual size, surmounted by 2 colossal statues, also in stone. Inside this precinct is a temple, and in the temple an image of Perseus. The people of Chemis say that Perseus often appears to them, sometimes within the sacred enclosure, sometimes in the open country. One of the sandals which he's worn is frequently found, 2 cubits in length, as they affirm, and then all Egypt flourishes greatly. In the worship of Perseus, Greek ceremonies are used. Gymnastic games are celebrated in his honor, comprising every kind of contest, with prizes of cattle, cloaks, and skins. I made inquiries of the Chemites why it was that Perseus appeared to them and not elsewhere in Egypt, and how they came to celebrate gymnastic contests unlike the rest of the Egyptians, to which they answered that Perseus belonged to their city by descent. Danaus and Lynceus were Chemites before they set sail for Greece, and from them Perseus was descended. They said, tracing the genealogy, and he, when he came to Egypt for the purpose, which the Greeks also assign, of bringing away from Libya the Gorgon's head, paid them a visit, and acknowledged them for his kinsmen. He had heard the name of their city from his mother before he left Greece, and bade them institute a gymnastic contest in his honor, and that was the reason why they observed the practice. The customs hitherto described are those of the Egyptians who live above the marsh country. The inhabitants of the marshes have the same customs as the rest, as well in those matters which have been mentioned above, as in respect of marriage, each Egyptian taking to himself, like the Greeks, a single wife. But for greater cheapness of living, the marshmen practice certain peculiar customs, such as these following. They gather the blossoms of a certain water lily, which grows in great abundance all over the flat country at the time when the Nile rises and floods the regions along its banks. The Egyptians call it the lotus. They gather, I say, the blossoms of this plant and dry them in the sun, after which they extract from the center of each blossom a substance like the head of a poppy, which they crush and make into bread. The root of the lotus is likewise eatable and has a pleasant sweet taste. It's round and about the size of an apple. There's also another species of the lily in Egypt, which grows like the lotus in the river and resembles the rose. The fruit springs up side by side with the blossom on a separate stalk, and has almost exactly the look of the comb made by wasps. It contains a number of seeds about the size of an olive stone, which are good to eat, and these are eaten both green and dried. The bibulus, papyrus, which grows year after year in the marshes, they pull up, and cutting the plant in two, reserve the upper portion for other purposes, but take the lower, which is about a cubit long, and either eat it or else sell it. Such as wish to enjoy the bibulus in full perfection, bake it first in a closed vessel, heated to a glow. Some of these folk, however, live entirely on fish, which are gutted as soon as caught, and then hung up in the sun. When dry, they are used as food. Gregarious fish are not found in any numbers in the rivers. They frequent the lagoons, whence at the season of breeding they proceed in shoals towards the sea. The males lead the way and drop their milt as they go, while the females, following close behind, eagerly swallow it down. From this they conceive, and when, after passing some time in the sea, they begin to be in spawn, the whole shoal sets off on its return to its ancient haunts. Now, however, it's no longer the males, but the females who take the lead. They swim in front in a body, and do exactly as the males did before, dropping little by little their grains of spawn as they go, while the males in the rear devour the grains, each one of which is a fish. A portion of the spawn escapes and is not swallowed by the males, and hence come the fishes which grow afterwards to maturity. When any of this sort of fish are taken on their passage to the sea, they are found to have the left side of the head scarred and bruised, while if taken on their return, the marks appear on the right. The reason is that as they swim down the Nile seaward, they keep close to the bank of the river upon their left, and returning again upstream, they still cling to the same side, hugging it and brushing against it constantly, to be sure that they miss not their road through the great force of the current. When the Nile begins to rise, the hollows in the land and the marshy spots near the river are flooded before any other places by the percolation of the water through the river banks, and these, almost as soon as they become pools, are found to be full of numbers of little fishes. I think that I understand how it is this comes to pass. On the subsidence of the Nile the year before, though the fish retired with the retreating waters, they had first deposited their spawn in the mud upon the banks, and so when at the usual season the water returns, small fry are rapidly engendered out of the spawn of the preceding year. So much concerning the fish. The Egyptians who live in the marshes use for the anointing of their bodies an oil made from the fruit of the silicyprium, which is known among them by the name of kiki. To obtain this, they plant the silicyprium, which grows wild in Greece, along the banks of the rivers and by the sides of the lakes, where it produces fruit in great abundance, but with a very disagreeable smell. This fruit is gathered and then bruised and pressed, or else boiled down after roasting. The liquid which comes from it is collected and is found to be unctuous, and as well suited as olive oil for lamps, only that it gives out an unpleasant odour. The contrivances which they use against gnats, wherewith the country swarms, are the following. In the parts of Egypt above the marshes, the inhabitants pass the night upon lofty towers, which are of great service, as the gnats are unable to fly to any height on account of the winds. In the marsh country, where there are no towers, each man possesses a net instead. By day it serves him to catch fish, while at night he spreads it over the bed in which he is to rest, and creeping in, goes to sleep underneath. The gnats, which, if he rolls himself up in his dress or in a piece of muslin, are sure to bite through the covering, don't so much as attempt to pass the net. The vessels used in Egypt for the transport of merchandise are made of the acantha, thorn. a tree which in its growth is very like the Cyrenaic lotus, and from which there exudes a gum. They cut a quantity of planks, about 2 cubits in length, from this tree, and then proceed to their shipbuilding, arranging the planks like bricks, and attaching them by ties to a number of long stakes or poles till the hull is complete, when they lay the cross planks on the top from side to side. They give the boats no ribs, but caulk the seams with papyrus on the inside. Each has a single rudder, which is driven straight through the keel. The mast is a piece of acantha wood, and the sails are made of papyrus. These boats can't make way against the current unless there's a brisk breeze. They are therefore towed upstream from the shore. Downstream they're managed as follows. There's a raft belonging to each, made of the wood of the tamarisk, fastened together with a watling of reeds, and also a stone bored through the middle about 2 talents in weight. The raft is fastened to the vessel by a rope and allowed to float down the stream in front, while the stone is attached by another rope astern. The result is that the raft, hurried forward by the current, goes rapidly down the river and drags the baris, for so they call this sort of boat, after it, while the stone, which is pulled along in the wake of the vessel and lies deep in the water, keeps the boat straight. There are a vast number of these vessels in Egypt, and some of them are of many thousand talents burthen. When the Nile overflows, the country is converted into a sea, and nothing appears but the cities, which look like the islands in the Aegean. At this season, boats no longer keep the course of the river, but sail right across the plain. On the voyage from Naucratis to Memphis at this season, you pass close to the pyramids, whereas the usual course is by the apex of the delta and the city of Cherkesauros. You can sail also from the maritime town of Canobus across the flat to Naucratis, passing by the cities of Anthilla and Archandropolis. The former of these cities, which is a place of note, is assigned expressly to the wife of the ruler of Egypt, for the time being, to keep her in shoes. Such has been the custom ever since Egypt fell under the Persian yoke. The other city seems to me to have got its name of Archandropolis from Arcander the Thean, son of Archaeus and son-in-law of Danaus. There might certainly have been another Arcander, but at any rate the name is not Egyptian. Thus far I've spoken of Egypt from my own observation, relating what I myself saw, the ideas that I formed, and the results of my own researches. What follows rests on the accounts given me by the Egyptians, which I shall now repeat, adding thereto some particulars which fell under my own notice. The priests said that Men was the first king of Egypt, and that it was he who raised the dike which protects Memphis from the inundations of the Nile. Before his time the river flowed entirely along the sandy ridge of hills which skirts Egypt on the side of Libya. He, however, by banking up the river at the bend which it forms about 100 furlongs south of Memphis, laid the ancient channel dry while he dug a new course for the stream halfway between the 2 lines of hills. To this day the elbow which the Nile forms at the point where it's forced aside into the new channel is guarded with the greatest care by the Persians and strengthened every year, for if the river were to burst out at this place and pour over the mound, there would be danger of Memphis being completely overwhelmed by the flood. Men, the first king, having thus, by turning the river, made the tract where it used to run dry land, proceeded in the first place to build the city now called Memphis, which lies in the narrow part of Egypt, after which he further excavated a lake outside the town to the north and west, communicating with the river, which was itself the eastern boundary. Besides these works, he also, the priests said, built the temple of Hephaestus, which stands within the city, a vast edifice, very worthy of mention. Next they read me from a papyrus the names of 330 monarchs, who, they said, were his successors upon the throne. In this number of generations there were 18 Ethiopian kings and 1 queen who was a native. All the rest were kings and Egyptians. The queen bore the same name as the Babylonian princes, namely Nitocris. They said that she succeeded her brother. He'd been king of Egypt and was put to death by his subjects, who then placed her upon the throne. Bent on avenging his death, she devised a cunning scheme by which she destroyed a vast number of Egyptians. She constructed a spacious underground chamber, and on pretence of inaugurating it, contrived the following. Inviting to a banquet those of the Egyptians whom she knew to have had the chief share in the murder of her brother, she suddenly, as they were feasting, let the river in upon them by means of a secret duct of large size. This and this only did they tell me of her, except that when she'd done as I've said, she threw herself into an apartment full of ashes, that she might escape the vengeance whereto she would otherwise have been exposed. The other kings, they said, were personages of no note or distinction, and left no monuments of any account, with the exception of the last, who was named Moiris. He left several memorials of his reign: the northern gateway of the temple of Hephaestus, the lake excavated by his orders, whose dimensions I shall give presently, and the pyramids built by him in the lake, the size of which will be stated when I describe the lake itself wherein they stand. Such were his works. The other kings left absolutely nothing. Passing over these monarchs, therefore, I shall speak of the king who reigned next, whose name was Sesostris. He, the priest said, first of all proceeded in a fleet of ships of war from the Arabian Gulf along the shores of the Erythraean Sea, subduing the nations as he went, until he finally reached a sea which could not be navigated by reason of the shoals. Hence he returned to Egypt, where, they told me, he collected a vast armament, and made a progress by land across the continent, conquering every people which fell in his way. In the countries where the natives withstood his attack and fought gallantly for their liberties, he erected pillars, on which he inscribed his own name and country, and how that he had here reduced the inhabitants to subjection by the might of his arms. Where, on the contrary, they submitted readily, and without a struggle, he inscribed on the pillars, in addition to these particulars, the female genitalia, to mark that they were a nation of women, that is, unwarlike and effeminate. In this he traversed the whole continent of Asia, whence he passed on into Europe, and made himself master of Scythia and of Thrace, beyond which countries I don't think that his army extended its march. For thus far the pillars which he erected are still visible, but in the remoter regions they are no longer found. Returning to Egypt from Thrace, he came on his way to the banks of the river Phasis. Here I can't say with any certainty what took place. Either he of his own accord detached a body of troops from his main army and left them to colonize the country, or else a certain number of his soldiers, wearied with their long wanderings, deserted and established themselves on the banks of this stream. There can be no doubt that the Colchians are an Egyptian race. Before I heard any mention of the fact from others, I had remarked it myself. After the thought had struck me, I made inquiries on the subject both in Colchis and in Egypt, and I found that the Colchians had a more distinct recollection of the Egyptians than the Egyptians had of them. Still, the Egyptians said that they believed the Colchians to be descended from the army of Sesostris. My own conjectures were founded first on the fact that they are black-skinned and have woolly hair, which certainly amounts to but little, since several other nations are so too, but further and more especially on the circumstance that the Colchians, the Egyptians, and the Ethiopians are the only nations who have practiced circumcision from the earliest times. The Phoenicians and the Syrians of Palestine themselves confess that they learnt the custom of the Egyptians, and the Syrians who dwell about the rivers Thermodon and Parthenius, as well as their neighbours the Macronians, say that they have recently adopted it from the Colchians. Now these are the only nations who use circumcision, and it's plain that they all imitate herein the Egyptians. With respect to the Ethiopians, indeed, I can't decide whether they learnt the practice of the Egyptians or the Egyptians of them. It's undoubtedly of very ancient date in Ethiopia, but that the others derived their knowledge of it from Egypt is clear to me from the fact that the Phoenicians, when they come to have commerce with the Greeks, cease to follow the Egyptians in this custom and allow their children to remain uncircumcised. I'll add a further proof to the identity of the Egyptians and the Colchians. These two nations weave their linen in exactly the same way, and this is a way entirely unknown to the rest of the world. They also, in their whole mode of life and in their language, resemble one another. The Colchian linen is called by the Greeks Sardinian, while that which comes from Egypt is known as Egyptian. The pillars which Sesostris erected in the conquered countries have for the most part disappeared, but in the part of Syria called Palestine I myself saw them still standing, with the writing above mentioned and the emblem distinctly visible. In Ionia also there are two representations of this prince engraved upon rocks, one on the road from Ephesus to Phocaea, the other between Sardis and Smyrna,